blood, and fiery sorrow. Abigail Monroe had built her life on law and order, but when Colt Dawson, an outlaw with a past tangled in hers, landed in her jail, she knew her carefully controlled world was about to fall apart. He leaned against the bars, his smirk slow and knowing. "You gonna keep me locked up, darlin'?" he murmured. "Or are you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The uninvited guest arrives. The desert wind howled a mournful tune, rattling the windows of the sheriff's office in the sleepy town of Redemption. Abigail Monroe, her silver-streaked hair pulled back tight in a bun, barely registered the sound. Years of weathering such storms, both literal and figurative, had taught her a stoicism that bordered on legendary. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, remained fixed on the ledger before her, the neat columns of figures a testament to her meticulous nature. Redemption was her town, her responsibility, and she guarded it with a ferocity born of both duty and a deep, abiding love. The rhythmic creak of the floorboards outside her office announced Deputy Thompson's approach. He was a good man, young and earnest, but still green around the edges. He often reminded Abigail of her younger brother, lost to a fever years ago, a loss that had carved a permanent ache in her heart. "Sheriff," Thompson said, his voice tinged with a nervousness that Abigail instantly recognized. "We got him. Colt Dawson." Abigail's hand stilled on the page, the quill hovering above the ink. The name was a phantom from her past, a ghost she'd thought long buried. Colt Dawson. The name tasted like ashes and regret on her tongue. It conjured images of sun-drenched days and reckless youth, of whispered promises and a love that had burned as bright and fierce as the desert sun, only to be extinguished by betrayal and bloodshed. "Bring him in," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil that raged within her. She kept her back straight, her posture unyielding, a fortress against the flood of memories threatening to breach her defenses. Thompson hesitated. He ain't exactly Cooper Otten, Sheriff. Might need your persuasion." Abigail finally looked up, her gray eyes, usually so calm and steady, now sparked with a flicker of something dangerous. "I'm well aware of Mr. Dawson's penchant for resistance, Deputy. Bring him in." The heavy wooden door swung open, revealing Colt Dawson in all his defiant glory. He was older, of course, the lines around his eyes etched deeper, the scar above his left eyebrow a stark reminder of the life he'd chosen. But the years hadn't diminished the raw magnetism that had once captivated her. He was lean and hardened, his dark hair long and untamed, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He was shackled, his wrists and ankles bound, but he carried himself with an air of untamed freedom, a wildness that Redemption, with all its laws and order, could never contain. He leaned against the doorframe, a smirk playing on his lips, his gaze raking over her with a familiarity that was both infuriating and strangely comforting. It was a look that stripped away the years, the badges, the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart. It saw through the sheriff, straight to the woman she'd once been, the woman she'd tried so hard to forget. Well, he drawled, his voice a low rumble that resonated deep within her. "Abigail Monroe. Sheriff Abigail Monroe. Never thought I'd see the day." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "You shouldn't have come back, Colt. And missed the chance to see you again, darlin'?" He chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent a wave of heat through her. "Not a chance. You're under arrest," she said, her voice regaining its composure. "For robbery, assault, and disturbing the peace." The last charge was almost laughable, given the gravity of his other alleged crimes, but it was the only one she could be certain of at that moment. He pushed himself off the doorframe, the chains rattling with the movement. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small office, making it feel suddenly claustrophobic. "You gonna keep me locked up, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or are you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history, with the weight of their shared past. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that belied her outward calm. She wanted to deny it, to scream at him, to throw him in the deepest, darkest cell, and throw away the key. But the truth, as stubborn and persistent as the desert weed, bloomed in the silence. She didn't want him to leave. Not entirely. The deputy shifted nervously, sensing the tension that crackled between them. Sheriff? Abigail tore her gaze away from Colt's, forcing herself to focus on the present, on the duties she'd sworn to uphold. Take him to cell block 3, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. And Thompson, make sure he's secure.
He's slippery.
Colt's smirk widened. You know me so well, Abigail. As Thompson led him away, Colt's eyes lingered on Abigail, a silent promise, a challenge, a memory, all rolled into one. She watched him go, her heart a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. She was the sheriff. She had a town to protect, a reputation to uphold. But as the echo of his footsteps faded, she couldn't deny the truth that whispered in the silence. Colt Dawson's return had not only disturbed the peace of redemption, it had disturbed the carefully guarded peace within her own soul. The carefully laid order of her life was broken, and there wasn't a lock strong enough to restore the broken, scattered pieces. She traced the star on her chest, the metal cold under her fingers, a stark contrast to the sudden heat that bloomed under her skin. It was going to be a long night. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Past Resurface. The iron door of cell block 3 clanged shut with a resounding finality, the sound echoing through the otherwise quiet jailhouse. Abigail stood outside the cell, watching Colt pace like a caged tiger. The dim light cast long shadows, making him appear even more formidable, more dangerous. He stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his eyes glinting in the semi-darkness. Comfortable, Dawson? Abigail asked, her voice betraying none of the unease she felt. She leaned against the opposite wall, trying to appear casual, unaffected by his presence. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. About as comfortable as a rattler in a henhouse, Sheriff. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the movement surprisingly graceful despite the shackles. Though I reckon the company's improved considerably. Abigail ignored the barb. You've caused quite a stir in redemption. Folks aren't used to your kind around here. My kind? He raised an eyebrow, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. And what kind is that, Abigail? The kind that remembers a certain fiery young woman who used to ride bareback across the plains, her hair flying in the wind? The kind that remembers stolen kisses under a sky full of stars? Abigail felt a flush creep up her neck. That was a long time ago, Colt.
We were different people then.
Were we? He took a step closer to the bars, his voice softening. Or have we just buried those people so deep, we've forgotten who they are? His words struck a chord, resonating with a truth she'd tried to ignore for years. She had buried that girl, the one who'd loved recklessly, who'd believed in second chances, who'd trusted Colt Dawson with her heart. She'd buried her under layers of responsibility, of duty, of the bitter disappointment that had followed his betrayal. You betrayed me, Colt, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You left me. You left us for what? He looked away, his gaze fixed on the stone floor. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations, with the ghosts of their shared past. It ain't that simple, Abigail. Then make it simple, she challenged, stepping closer to the bars.
Tell me why.
Tell me why you chose that life, over me. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I did what I thought I had to do. To protect you. Protect me? Abigail scoffed. By joining a gang of outlaws? By robbing and in killing? There were things you didn't know, Abigail. Things about my family, about my past. Things that would have put you in danger. And what about now? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Are you still protecting me, Colt? By riding into town, guns blazing, stirring up trouble? He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold iron bars, inches from her hand. I came back for you, Abigail. That's the truth. Whether you believe it or not. The raw honesty in his voice, the vulnerability in his eyes, was almost her undoing. She wanted to believe him, to reach out and touch him, to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. But the years of hurt, of doubt, of self-preservation held her back. "I can't trust you, Colt," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "Not anymore." He withdrew his hand, his expression hardening. "Then, I guess we're at an impasse, Sheriff." The sound of footsteps approaching broke the tense silence. Deputy Thompson appeared, carrying a tray of food. "Supper, Dawson," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Colt glanced at the meager fare, then back at Abigail. "Tell me, Sheriff," he said, a hint of his old smirk returning. "Do you treat all your prisoners this well?" Abigail ignored the jibe. "Enjoy your meal, Dawson," she said, turning to leave. "We'll talk again in the morning." As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her, burning into her back. She resisted the urge to turn around, to look back at him, to see if the flicker of vulnerability she'd glimpsed was still there. She had a town to run, a job to do, and she couldn't afford to let her past, no matter how compelling, distract her from her duty. Back in her office, Abigail sat at her desk, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to appear, bright and distant, just as they had been all those years ago. She remembered the night Colt had first kissed her, under a blanket of those very stars. She'd felt like she could fly, like anything was possible. Now, those same stars seemed to mock her, reminding her of all she'd lost, of all she could never have again. She reached for the bottle of whiskey she kept hidden in the bottom drawer, a habit she developed over the years to numb the ache in her heart. As she poured herself a drink, she wondered if Colt was looking at those same stars, thinking of her, regretting the choices that had led them to this place. And for the first time in a long time, a tear, hot and unwelcome, traced a path down her weathered cheek. The past had a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deep you tried to bury it. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in the dead of night. The moon hung high and full, casting an ethereal glow over redemption. The town was quiet, the saloons closed, the streets deserted. But inside the jailhouse, sleep was a distant luxury. Abigail sat at her desk, the half-empty bottle of whiskey a silent testament to her troubled thoughts. The paperwork in front of her blurred, the numbers and figures meaningless. All she could see was Colt's face, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and something else, something that looked a lot like pain. A soft knock on the door startled her. She quickly capped the whiskey bottle and shoved it back in the drawer, her heart pounding with a sudden, irrational fear. "Who is it?" "It's me, Sheriff
Thompson."
Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
"Come in, Deputy."
Thompson entered, his face etched with concern. "Couldn't sleep, Sheriff. Thought I'd check on things." He glanced towards the cell block, his meaning clear. "He's still locked up, if that's what you're worried about," Abigail said, a touch of defensiveness in her voice. "It ain't just that, Sheriff," Thompson said, his gaze meeting hers. "Folks are talking. They're scared. Colt Dawson, he's got a reputation. And they're wondering why you haven't dealt with him." Abigail sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Dealt with him how, Deputy? He hasn't been tried yet. He's still entitled to due process, even if he is Colt Dawson." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "I know, Sheriff, but some are saying you're soft on him, because of your history." Abigail's jaw tightened. "My history is my own, Deputy. It has no bearing on how I do my job." "Maybe," Thompson said, his voice hesitant. "But appearances matter, Sheriff, especially in a town like this." His words stung, hitting a nerve she'd tried to ignore. She knew the rumors were swirling, the whispers spreading like wildfire through the small community. She was the sheriff, and her past with an outlaw was now a matter of public scrutiny, a threat to her authority. "I'll handle it, Deputy," she said, her voice firm. "You have my word." Thompson nodded, but his eyes still held a flicker of doubt. "Just be careful, Sheriff. He's a dangerous man." After Thompson left, Abigail found herself pacing the office, her mind racing. She couldn't let the rumors undermine her, but she also couldn't ignore the danger Colt posed, both to the town and to her own carefully constructed life. She needed a plan, a way to resolve the situation quickly and decisively. An idea, dangerous and reckless, began to form in her mind. She walked towards the cell block, her steps determined. She found Colt awake, sitting on the edge of his cot, staring out the small, barred window at the moonlit sky. He turned as she approached, his eyes questioning. "Can't sleep, Sheriff?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "We need to talk, Dawson," she said, her voice low and serious. He raised an eyebrow. "About what? My imminent hanging?" Abigail ignored the sarcasm. "About a deal." His expression changed, the amusement fading, replaced by a cautious curiosity. "What kind of deal?" She leaned closer to the bars, her voice barely a whisper. "I need information. About the Blackwood gang. About their plans." Colt's eyes narrowed. The Blackwood gang was notorious, their ruthlessness legendary. They were the reason Colt was here, the reason he was facing a long list of charges. "And what makes you think I'd betray them?" he asked, his voice hard. "Because you're not one of them, Colt," Abigail said, her voice pleading. "Not anymore. And because I'm offering you a way out." He scoffed. "A way out? You think I believe that?" "I can't promise you freedom, Colt," she said, her voice honest. "But I can promise you a reduced sentence. A chance to start over. Somewhere else." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to gauge her sincerity. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken possibilities, with the weight of their shared past. "And what if I refuse?" he asked, his voice low. Abigail's heart clenched. "Then you'll hang, Colt. Or spend the rest of your life in prison. And the Blackwood gang will continue their reign of terror." He looked away, his jaw tight. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between loyalty and self-preservation, between his past and the possibility of a future. Finally, he looked back at her, his expression resolute. "I want to see my sister. Before she has that baby." Abigail swallowed, relief flooding her.
"It's a deal, then."
"I'll arrange it. Discreetly, with protection, one visit. But only once I know the full details. You give me that?" He nodded, a single, curt gesture. "You'll get your information, Sheriff. But don't think for a minute this changes anything between us." "I don't," Abigail said, her voice betraying a hint of sadness. "But maybe it can change things for you." As she walked away, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile spark in the darkness. She'd made a bargain with the devil, a dangerous gamble that could cost her everything. But she'd also seen a glimpse of the man Colt once was, the man she'd loved, the man she still, perhaps, held a sliver of hope for. And that, she realized, was the most dangerous gamble of all. The moon was already beginning its slow descent. Chapter 4. The Price of Freedom and Loyalty. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and purple as Abigail led Colt, shackled and under heavy guard, out of the jailhouse. The town was still asleep, the streets empty, the silence broken only by the chirping of birds and the muffled sound of their footsteps. They were headed towards the outskirts of Redemption, to the small, dilapidated homestead where Colt's sister, Sarah, lived. Abigail had arranged the meeting with utmost secrecy, knowing that any leak could jeopardize the entire operation and potentially put Sarah in danger. She'd chosen Deputy Thompson and 2 other trusted men to accompany them, men she knew she could rely on, men who understood the delicate balance between law and loyalty. Colt walked beside her, his head held high, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the jail, his silence a heavy presence beside her. Abigail wondered what was going through his mind, what thoughts and emotions were swirling beneath his stoic facade. "She doesn't know you're coming, does she?" Abigail asked, breaking the silence. Colt shook his head.
"No."
"I didn't want to get her hopes up in case things didn't work out." Abigail nodded, understanding his caution. She knew how much Sarah meant to Colt, how protective he was of his younger sister. She was the only family he had left, the only link to a life before the outlaw trail. As they approached the homestead, Abigail saw a figure emerge from the small, weathered house. Sarah. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen with new life, her face pale and drawn. But as she saw Colt, her eyes widened and a smile, hesitant at first, spread across her face. "Colt?" she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Colt's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. He quickened his pace, the shackles clinking with the movement. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. They met halfway, embracing in a fierce hug that spoke volumes of their love and longing. Abigail watched them, her heart aching with a mixture of envy and sadness. She'd never had that kind of bond with anyone, not even with her own brother. Her life had been dedicated to duty, to upholding the law, to protecting others. But in doing so, she'd closed herself off to the possibility of true connection, of love and family. What are you doing here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling as she pulled away from Colt, her eyes searching his face. "I needed to see you," Colt said, his hand resting gently on her swollen belly.
To make sure you were all right. But how?
She looked at Abigail, her expression questioning. "I made a deal," Abigail said, stepping forward. "Colt is cooperating with the law, in exchange for certain considerations." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her gaze shifting between Abigail and Colt. "What kind of deal?" Colt hesitated, glancing at Abigail. He knew he couldn't reveal the full truth, not yet. "It's complicated, Sarah. But it's a chance for me to make things right." Sarah studied him for a moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Can I trust her, Colt?" she asked, her gaze fixed on Abigail. Colt met Abigail's eyes, a silent plea in his gaze. He needed her to reassure his sister, to give her a reason to believe in him, in this fragile hope of a new beginning. Abigail stepped closer to Sarah, her voice firm and sincere. "You can trust me to keep my word, Sarah. I'm giving Colt a chance to redeem himself. And I'm doing it for him, and for you." Sarah searched Abigail's face, her eyes assessing, probing. Finally, she nodded, a slow, hesitant gesture. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I trust you, Sheriff." The relief that washed over Abigail was palpable. She'd earned Sarah's trust, a small victory in the midst of a much larger battle. They spent the next hour in strained conversation, the shadow of Colt's past and uncertain future hanging heavy over them. Sarah shared news of her impending motherhood, her hopes and fears for the child she carried. Colt listened intently, his eyes filled with a tenderness Abigail had never seen before. It was a glimpse of the man he could have been, the man he might still become. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Abigail knew it was time to leave. The risk of being discovered was growing with each passing moment. She signaled to her deputies, who moved to flank Colt. "It's time to go," she said, her voice regretful. Colt nodded, his expression stoic. He embraced Sarah one last time, whispering words of comfort and reassurance in her ear. Then he turned to Abigail, his eyes meeting hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. Abigail nodded, her heart heavy. She knew this was just the beginning, that the road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But she'd seen a flicker of hope in Colt's eyes, a glimmer of the man he could be. And that, she realized, was worth fighting for. As they walked away, she knew the price of freedom and loyalty was steep, and she had only just begun to pay. The weight of her badge felt heavier than ever. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Wind Carry Secrets. The ride back to redemption was quiet, each member of the small posse lost in their own thoughts. Abigail replayed the visit with Sarah in her mind, analyzing every word, every gesture. Colt's gratitude had been genuine, she was sure of it. But gratitude wouldn't be enough to keep him alive, or to stop the Blackwood gang. She needed information, and she needed it fast. As they entered the town, Abigail noticed the curious glances, the hushed whispers that followed them. The news of Colt's capture had spread like wildfire, and his brief, escorted excursion wouldn't have gone unnoticed. She knew she'd have to address the town's concerns, to reassure them that she had the situation under control. Back in her office, Abigail dismissed her deputies, instructing them to maintain a heightened state of alert. She then summoned Colt from his cell, bringing him into her office, the door firmly closed behind them. "All right, Dawson," she said, her voice all business. "You saw your sister. Now it's time to uphold your end of the bargain." Colt leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," Abigail said, her gaze unwavering. "The Blackwood Gang's plans, their hideouts, their contacts. Everything." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes searching hers. She knew he was weighing the risks, calculating the consequences of betrayal. He was a man caught between two worlds, torn between loyalty to his past and the promise of a future. "They're planning a big one," he finally said, his voice low. "Bigger than anything they've done before. They're going to hit the stagecoach carrying the gold shipment from the Silver Creek mine." Abigail's eyes widened. The Silver Creek mine was one of the richest in the territory, and its gold shipments were heavily guarded. The Blackwood Gang's audacity was breathtaking, their ambition terrifying. "When?" she asked, her voice sharp. 3 days, Colt said. "At dawn. They'll ambush it at Devil's Pass." Devil's Pass. A narrow, treacherous canyon, notorious for its ambushes and rock slides. It was the perfect place for an attack, a death trap for anyone caught unawares. "How many men?" Abigail asked, her mind already racing, formulating a plan. 20, maybe more, Colt said. "Heavily armed. And they've got a new weapon, a Gatling gun." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. A Gatling gun. A rapid-firing weapon capable of mowing down dozens of men in minutes. The Blackwood Gang had just upped the stakes, and the odds were stacked heavily against her. "Who's leading the operation?" she asked, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. Colt hesitated again, his gaze dropping to the floor. This was the hardest part, she knew. Betraying his former comrades, the men he'd ridden with, fought alongside. "Reyes," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Jackson Reyes." The name sent a shockwave through Abigail. Jackson Reyes. Colt's closest friend, his second in command. The man who'd saved Colt's life more than once. The man who, according to the whispers, had been like a brother to him. "Reyes," she repeated, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. "I see." The betrayal cut deep. She could see it in Colt's eyes. He'd given her the information she needed, but at a great personal cost. He'd broken the outlaw's code, the bond of loyalty that had held him captive for so long. "There's more," Colt said, his voice strained. "There's a traitor. Someone inside, someone feeding Reyes information." Abigail's heart skipped a beat. A traitor. Inside her own town, perhaps even within her own ranks. The thought was sickening, the implications devastating. "Who?" she asked, her voice urgent. "Who is it?" Colt shook his head. "I don't know. But Reyes knows things he shouldn't. About the shipments, the guards, the routes. Someone's talking." Abigail felt a wave of anger, of frustration, of fear. She had a town to protect, a gang of outlaws to stop, and now, a traitor to uncover. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, almost crushing. "We need to stop them, Colt," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We need to stop them before they kill anyone else." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm with you, Abigail," he said, his voice firm. "I'll help you. In any way I can." The whispers in the wind had carried secrets, revealing a plot far more dangerous and complex than she'd imagined. But they'd also carried a promise, a commitment from a man who was finally choosing to stand on the side of the law, on the side of right. And that, Abigail knew, was a weapon more powerful than any Gatling gun. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a split second saw the boy he had been, and the faintest glimmer of the man he might still become. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, as if echoing the storm that was brewing both inside and outside her office. Chapter 6. The thin line between law and desire. The information Colt provided was a ticking clock. 3 days until the Blackwood Gang attacked the gold shipment, and Abigail had to prepare, knowing a traitor lurked somewhere in redemption. She spent the next day in a whirlwind of activity, organizing her deputies, strengthening the town's defenses, and sending a coded message to the nearest army outpost, requesting reinforcements. She kept Colt close, grilling him for every detail he could remember about the Blackwood gang's tactics, their strengths and weaknesses. He was surprisingly cooperative, his knowledge invaluable, his insights sharp and often unsettling. He was still an outlaw, his hands stained with blood, his past shrouded in darkness. But he was also her only link to stopping Reyes, to preventing a massacre. As they worked together, Abigail found herself drawn to him, to the man he was now, the man he was trying to be. She saw the regret in his eyes, the genuine desire to make amends for his past mistakes. She saw the intelligence, the courage, the resilience that had once captivated her, and that, despite everything, still held a powerful sway over her. But she couldn't afford to be swayed. She was the sheriff, and he was a prisoner, an outlaw, a man who'd broken her heart. She had to maintain a professional distance, to keep her emotions in check, to focus on the task at hand. One evening, after a long day of planning and preparation, Abigail found herself alone with Colt in her office. The lamp cast long shadows, illuminating the exhaustion on their faces, the tension that simmered between them. "You're tired," Colt said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You should rest." Abigail leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. "I can't. Not yet. There's still too much to do." He stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the darkening sky. "You can't save the world, Abigail. Not all by yourself." "I have to try," she said, her voice weary. "It's my job." He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "It's more than a job to you, isn't it? It's everything." She met his gaze, her defenses crumbling under his scrutiny. "It's all I have," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small space between them. "It doesn't have to be," he said, his voice low and husky. The air crackled with unspoken desire, with the memory of their shared past, with the forbidden longing that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin against hers. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. "Don't, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't make this harder than it already is." He stopped, his hand hovering inches from her face. He searched her eyes, his gaze filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Is it hard, Abigail?" he asked, his voice raw. "Or is it impossible?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. It was hard, agonizingly so, but it was also impossible. They were on opposite sides of the law, their pasts a chasm between them, their futures uncertain. "It's both," she said, her voice choked with emotion. He withdrew his hand, his expression hardening. "Then, I guess we have our answer." He turned away, walking back towards the window, his shoulders slumped. Abigail watched him, her heart aching with a sense of loss, of regret. She'd pushed him away, again, protecting herself, protecting her heart. But in doing so, she'd also extinguished a flicker of hope, a fragile possibility of something more. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of their impossible situation. Abigail knew she'd made the right choice, the only choice she could make. But it didn't make it any easier. "We should get back to work," she said, her voice regaining its composure. "We have a lot to do before dawn." He nodded, his back still to her.
"Right."
"The law waits." The line between law and desire had never been thinner, more blurred. And as they continued their preparations, Abigail knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing her duty with her heart, her past with her present, her fear with her desire. And one wrong step could send her tumbling into the abyss. She glanced at the calendar on her desk. 2 days. Time was slipping away like sand through her fingers. Chapter 7. Scars that time cannot erase. The following day brought a new wave of tension to redemption. The townsfolk, sensing the impending danger, grew increasingly restless, their fear palpable. Abigail did her best to reassure them, promising to protect them, to keep them safe. But she knew her words were hollow, her promises fragile. She was facing a formidable enemy, an unknown traitor, and a man she couldn't entirely trust, despite his cooperation. She spent the morning reviewing the plans with her deputies, making sure every detail was accounted for, every contingency considered. She needed to be prepared for anything, to anticipate every move the Blackwood gang might make. In the afternoon, she decided to visit Sarah again, to check on her well-being and to gather any further information she might have gleaned from Colt during their previous visit. She found Sarah sitting on the porch, her hands resting on her swollen belly, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" Abigail asked, approaching her cautiously. Sarah looked up, a faint smile gracing her lips.
"Better, thank you, Sheriff."
"The baby's kicking up a storm, but it's a good feeling." Abigail sat down beside her, the silence stretching between them, comfortable and familiar. "Colt told me about the attack," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. "On the stagecoach." Abigail nodded. "He's been cooperating." Sarah's eyes searched Abigail's face. "He's changed, Sheriff. I can see it. He's trying." "I know," Abigail said, her voice soft. "But it's a long road, Sarah. And he's made a lot of enemies." "He's also made a lot of mistakes," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and regret. "But he's not a bad man, Sheriff. Not at heart." Abigail knew that was true. She'd seen glimpses of the good man Colt could be, the man he'd once been. But the scars of his past, both physical and emotional, ran deep, and they were a constant reminder of the choices he'd made, the life he'd led. "He told me about you too," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "About how it used to be." Abigail felt a flush creep up her neck. She hadn't expected Colt to share that part of his past with his sister. "That was a long time ago, Sarah. We were different people then." "Maybe," Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. "But some feelings, they don't just disappear. They linger, like a scar that time cannot erase." Her words struck a chord, resonating with a truth Abigail had tried to deny. She did still have feelings for Colt, feelings she'd buried deep, feelings she'd tried to ignore. But they were there, undeniable, a constant reminder of what she'd lost, of what she could never have. "He hurt me, Sarah," Abigail said, her voice choked with emotion. "He broke my heart." "I know," Sarah said, her voice filled with compassion. "But he hurt himself, too, Sheriff. More than you know." She reached out and took Abigail's hand, her touch surprisingly strong. "Give him a chance, Sheriff. Not just for him, but for yourself. For the girl you used to be, the girl who believed in second chances." Abigail looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with tears. She'd come to check on Sarah, to gather information, but she'd ended up receiving a lesson in forgiveness, in compassion, in the enduring power of love. As she rode back to town, Abigail reflected on Sarah's words, on the scars that time could not erase. She knew the road ahead was still fraught with danger, that the odds were stacked against her. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, that she had allies in unexpected places, and that, perhaps, there was still a chance for redemption, for healing, for a new beginning. She arrived back at the jailhouse to find Thompson waiting for her, his face grim. "Sheriff," he said, his voice urgent. "We have a problem." Abigail's heart sank. "What is it?" "The reinforcements," Thompson said, his voice strained. "They're delayed. A rockslide blocked the pass. They won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest." Abigail felt a wave of despair wash over her. They were on their own. Against the Blackwood gang. Against the Gatling gun. Against the unknown traitor. The scars of the past seemed to deepen, threatening to consume her. But she couldn't afford to break. Not now. Not ever. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze hardening with resolve. "Then we'll do it ourselves," she said, her voice firm. "We'll stop them, Thompson. No matter the cost." Chapter 8. A town divided by suspicion. The news of the delayed reinforcements spread through Redemption like a chilling wind, fueling the already simmering fear and distrust. The townsfolk, realizing they were on their own, began to turn on each other, their whispers turning into accusations, their anxieties into open hostility. Abigail found herself battling not only an external enemy, but also the internal divisions that threatened to tear her town apart. She called a town meeting, gathering the residents in the dusty square, the setting sun casting long shadows over their faces. She stood on the makeshift platform, her deputies flanking her, Colt conspicuously absent, still locked in his cell. "I know you're scared," she said, her voice ringing out across the square. "I know you're worried, but we cannot let fear divide us. We must stand together, united against this threat." Her words were met with a mixture of skepticism and defiance. A murmur rippled through the crowd, fueled by the rumors and suspicions that had been circulating. "How can we trust you, Sheriff?" a voice shouted from the crowd. "When you're harboring an outlaw in your own jail." It was Jedediah, the blacksmith, a man known for his gruff demeanor and his deep-seated distrust of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of law-abiding. Abigail met his gaze unflinchingly. "Colt Dawson is cooperating with the law," she said, her voice firm. "He's providing us with information that could save lives."
"He's an outlaw,"
another voice yelled. "He'll betray us, just like he betrayed you before." The accusation stung, hitting a raw nerve. Abigail knew the whispers about her past with Colt had reached every corner of redemption, undermining her authority, casting doubt on her judgment. "My past is my own," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It has no bearing on my ability to protect this town." "But it does, Sheriff." It was Martha, the owner of the general store, her face pale and drawn. "It shows you can't be trusted. You're blinded by your feelings for him." The murmur grew louder, the accusations more pointed. Abigail felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the trust she'd worked so hard to build eroding before her eyes. "Enough!" a voice boomed from the back of the crowd. It was Reverend Johnson, the town's spiritual leader, a man respected for his wisdom and his unwavering faith. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. "Have you all lost your minds?" he thundered. "Sheriff Monroe has dedicated her life to this town, to protecting us. And now, when we need her most, you turn on her? You accuse her of weakness?" He turned to face the crowd, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "We are facing a great danger, yes. But the greatest danger is not the Blackwood Gang. It's the fear and suspicion that is tearing us apart. We must trust in each other, in our sheriff, and in the Lord. Only then can we hope to survive this." His words had a calming effect, the tension in the square easing slightly. The townsfolk, ashamed of their outburst, looked down at their feet, their anger replaced by a sense of unease. Abigail stepped forward, her voice regaining its strength. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, her gaze meeting his. "I understand your concerns, your fears. But I promise you, I will not let you down. I will protect this town, no matter the cost." She looked out at the crowd, her eyes filled with determination. "We will stand together as one. We will face this threat, and we will prevail. Because that's what redemption does. We survive." Her words, bolstered by the Reverend's support, seemed to instill a renewed sense of hope, a fragile unity in the face of adversity. The townsfolk, still apprehensive, but no longer openly hostile, began to disperse, returning to their homes, their businesses, their lives. Abigail watched them go, her heart heavy with the burden of their trust, with the knowledge that she was their only line of defense against a ruthless enemy and an unknown traitor. The town was divided, suspicion lingering in the air, but she had managed to quell the open rebellion, to buy herself some time. As she walked back towards the jailhouse, she knew that the real battle was just beginning. And she had to be ready, not only to face the Blackwood Gang but also to confront the demons within her own town, and within her own heart. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange, a fitting backdrop for the showdown that was to come. Chapter 9. The Outlaw's Code and the Sheriff's Dilemma. With the town meeting over and a fragile truce established, Abigail returned to the jailhouse, her mind racing. She needed to finalize the plan to stop the Blackwood gang, and she needed to figure out who the traitor was. But she also needed to talk to Colt, to understand his motivations, to gauge his loyalty, to confront the unspoken feelings that still simmered between them. She found him sitting on his cot, his gaze fixed on the barred window, his expression unreadable. He turned as she approached, his eyes questioning. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "About as well as could be expected," Abigail said, her voice weary. "They're scared, Colt. And they don't trust me or you." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I'm not surprised. I'm an outlaw, Abigail. They have every reason to distrust me. But you're helping us," she said, her voice pleading. "You're risking your life to stop Reyes." "I'm doing what I have to do," he said, his voice evasive. "To make amends." Abigail stepped closer to the bars, her gaze searching his. "Is that all it is, Colt? Repentance? Or is there something more?" He looked away, his jaw tight. He wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't give her the answer she craved. "Tell me about Reyes," she said, changing the subject, trying to regain her composure. "Tell me about your friendship." He hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with a pain she couldn't fully comprehend. "We were like brothers," he finally said, his voice low. "We rode together, fought together, saved each other's lives more times than I can count." "What happened?" Abigail asked, her voice gentle. "What changed?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. "He changed," he said, his voice bitter. "Power, greed, it corrupted him. He became someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't trust. And yet, you remained loyal to him," Abigail said, her voice questioning. "Until now," he scoffed. "Loyalty? There's no such thing in the outlaw world, Abigail. Only self-preservation. You do what you have to do to survive. But you're not doing that now, are you?" she challenged, her voice rising. "You're betraying your former comrades, risking your life to help me, to help a town that hates you."
"Why?"
He finally met her gaze, his eyes blazing with a raw intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Because I owe you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Because I owe you for everything." The unspoken words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared past, with the love they'd lost, with the betrayal that had shattered their lives. Abigail's heart ached with a longing she couldn't deny, with a desire that defied logic, that defied the law, that defied everything she believed in. "You don't owe me anything, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "You made your choices, and I made mine." "But I made the wrong choices," he said, his voice filled with regret. "And I've paid the price. Every day." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold iron bars, inches from her hand. "I'm not the same man I was, Abigail. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, or your love. I'm just asking for a chance to do what's right." The outlaw's code, the bond of loyalty he'd lived by for so long, was crumbling. And in its place, a new code was emerging, a code of redemption, of second chances, of a love that had refused to die. Abigail's dilemma was clear. She needed him, his knowledge, his skills, his courage. But she also feared him, his past, his power over her, the feelings he still evoked in her. She was the sheriff, and he was the outlaw, and the line between them was becoming increasingly blurred. "I'll give you that chance, Colt," she said, her voice firm, despite the turmoil within her. "But don't expect anything more. Not from me, not from this town." He nodded, his expression stoic. "I understand." As she walked away, she knew she was walking a tightrope, balancing her duty with her heart, her past with her present, her fear with her desire. And the stakes were higher than ever. The outlaw and the sheriff, bound by a shared past, a dangerous present, and an uncertain future. The dilemma was a knot that tightened with every passing hour. Chapter 10. Reckoning Under the Desert Sun. The day of the planned ambush dawned hot and dry, the desert sun beating down mercilessly on the small band of defenders gathered at Devil's Pass. Abigail, Colt, and her deputies, along with a handful of volunteers from the town, were hidden among the rocks and canyons, waiting for the Blackwood gang to arrive. The tension was palpable, the silence broken only by the occasional caw of a raven, the rustle of the wind through the dry brush. Abigail scanned the horizon, her eyes narrowed, her senses on high alert. She'd positioned her men strategically, using the terrain to their advantage, hoping to offset the Blackwood gang's superior numbers and firepower. Colt stood beside her, his rifle in hand, his gaze fixed on the narrow entrance to the pass. He was calm, focused, his outlaw past seemingly forgotten, replaced by a steely determination that both impressed and unnerved Abigail. "They'll be here soon," he said, his voice low. "Reyes won't waste any time." Abigail nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew this was it, the moment of reckoning, the culmination of all their planning, all their fears, all their hopes. "Remember the plan," she said, her voice firm. "We hold our fire until they're fully inside the pass. Then we hit them hard and fast. No one engages Reyes directly, except me. Understood?" Colt met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and concern. "Be careful, Abigail. He's ruthless, and he won't hesitate to kill you." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But I won't hesitate either." The words hung in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced, of the personal stakes involved. Abigail knew this wasn't just about stopping an outlaw gang, it was about confronting her past, about facing the man who'd betrayed her, about proving to herself and to the town that she was strong enough, capable enough, worthy enough to be their sheriff. Suddenly, a shout rang out from one of the lookouts. "They're coming!" Abigail's heart leaped into her throat. She raised her rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, the rumble of the stagecoach wheels echoing through the canyon. The Blackwood gang rode into the pass, Reyes at their head, his face a mask of cold determination. They were heavily armed, confident, unaware of the trap that awaited them. Abigail waited, her breath held, her muscles tense. She let them ride deeper into the pass, until they were fully surrounded, until escape was impossible. Then she gave the signal. "Fire!" The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the roar of rifles mixing with the shouts of men, the screams of horses. The Blackwood gang, caught completely by surprise, scattered in confusion, their initial confidence turning into panicked chaos. Abigail focused on Reyes, her rifle trained on his chest. He was firing back, his shots wild and desperate, his eyes searching for his attacker. "Reyes!" Abigail shouted, her voice ringing out above the din of battle. "It's over." He saw her then, his eyes widening in recognition, his expression hardening with hatred. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail saw the flash of the muzzle, heard the crack of the gunshot, felt a searing pain in her shoulder. She staggered back, her rifle slipping from her grasp. But before Reyes could fire again, another shot rang out. Reyes jerked, his eyes widening in surprise, his pistol falling to the ground. He clutched his chest, blood staining his shirt, his gaze fixed on the figure who'd shot him. Colt. He stood there, his rifle smoking, his expression grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and something else. Something that looked a lot like care. The remaining members of the Blackwood gang, leaderless and demoralized, were quickly subdued, their weapons surrendered, their fight extinguished. The battle was over, shorter and less bloody than Abigail had feared. But the reckoning wasn't over.
"Not yet."
Abigail, clutching her wounded shoulder, walked towards Reyes, who lay on the ground, his breathing shallow, his life ebbing away. She looked down at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and a strange sense of pity. "Why, Reyes?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Why did you do it?" He coughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Greed power," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It consumes you." His eyes flickered towards Colt, a flicker of remorse in their depths. "Colt, he never finished the sentence." His eyes closed, his body went limp, his life extinguished. Abigail turned to Colt, who stood there, silently watching, his expression unreadable. The desert sun beat down on them, illuminating the aftermath of the battle, the bodies, the blood, the broken dreams. The reckoning had come, and it had left its mark on everyone. Chapter 11. Betrayal cuts deeper than bullets. The immediate aftermath of the battle was a blur of activity. Abigail, despite her wounded shoulder, directed the deputies and volunteers, securing the remaining outlaws, tending to the injured, and collecting the scattered weapons and stolen gold. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the fight began to fade, replaced by a throbbing pain in her shoulder and a growing sense of exhaustion. Thompson approached her, his face etched with concern.
Sheriff, you need to let me tend to that wound.
It looks bad. Abigail waved him off, her gaze fixed on Colt, who was standing a short distance away, his back to her, his shoulders slumped.
I'm fine, Thompson. Just see to the others.
She knew she wasn't fine, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when the town was watching, not when Colt was so distant. She needed to talk to him, to understand why he'd saved her, what it meant, what it changed. But before she could reach him, a shout rang out from one of the deputies guarding the prisoners.
Sheriff,
we've got a problem. Abigail's heart sank. She rushed towards the commotion, her wounded shoulder screaming in protest. She found the deputies gathered around one of the captured outlaws, a young man, his face pale and terrified. What is it? Abigail asked, her voice sharp. He says he knows who the traitor is, the deputy said, his voice trembling. He says it's Thompson. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Thompson? Her trusted deputy, the young man who reminded her of her lost brother? It couldn't be true. It had to be a lie. That's a lie. Thompson shouted, his face turning red. He's making it up. He's trying to save his own skin. The young outlaw shook his head, his eyes wide with fear.
No.
It's true. He was the one he was feeding Rhea's information about the shipments, the guards, everything. Abigail looked at Thompson, her eyes searching his, trying to find a trace of denial, of innocence. But all she saw was guilt, shame, and a desperate fear that mirrored her own. Thompson, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Is it true? He wouldn't meet her gaze. He looked down at his feet, his shoulders shaking. I didn't have a choice, he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion.
They threatened my family.
My mother, my sister, they said they'd kill them if I didn't cooperate. Abigail felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Betrayal. It cut deeper than any bullet, leaving a wound that festered and poisoned everything it touched. She'd trusted Thompson, relied on him, and he'd betrayed her, betrayed the town, betrayed everything she stood for. You should have come to me, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. We could have protected them. We could have found another way. I was scared, he said, his voice pleading. I didn't know what to do. Abigail looked at him, her heart aching with a sense of loss, of betrayal. She'd lost so much already, and now she'd lost another piece of her faith, another piece of her heart. Take him away, she said, her voice cold and emotionless. Lock him up. He'll face justice, just like the rest of them. As the deputies led Thompson away, his head hung low, his body trembling, Abigail turned to Colt, who'd witnessed the entire scene, his expression unreadable. You knew, she said, her voice accusing. You knew it was him. He nodded, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. I suspected, he said, his voice low. But I didn't have proof. And I didn't want to believe it.
Why not?
She asked, her voice bitter.
You're an outlaw.
Betrayal is your stock in trade. He flinched, as if she'd struck him. That's not fair, Abigail, he said, his voice strained. I may have made mistakes, but I've never betrayed anyone I cared about. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Abigail's heart ached with a confusion she couldn't understand, with a longing she couldn't deny. She'd been betrayed by someone she trusted, and saved by someone she distrusted. The world had turned upside down, and she was struggling to find her footing. I need some time, she said, her voice trembling. To process this. She turned and walked away, leaving Colt standing there, alone, the weight of his past and her present pressing down on him. The betrayal cut deeper than bullets, and the wounds were far from healed. The desert sun seemed to mock her, its heat oppressive, its light unforgiving. Chapter 12. Echoes of a Forbidden Love. The following days were a blur of activity as Abigail dealt with the aftermath of the ambush and Thompson's betrayal. She oversaw the transport of the captured outlaws to the territorial prison, arranged for the return of the stolen gold, and began the long process of rebuilding trust within her shattered town. She avoided Colt, keeping him confined to his cell, unsure of how to deal with him, with her feelings for him, with the complex web of loyalty and betrayal that had entangled them. She knew she needed to make a decision about his fate, but she couldn't bring herself to face him, to confront the emotions that his presence stirred within her. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over redemption, Abigail found herself drawn to the jailhouse, to Colt's cell. She stood outside, watching him through the bars, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He was sitting on his cot, his head in his hands, his posture one of defeat. She couldn't stand it any longer. She unlocked the cell door and stepped inside, the metal clang echoing in the silence. He looked up, his eyes surprised, then wary. "Abigail? We need to talk," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. He nodded, his expression unreadable. He gestured towards the small stool in the corner of the cell. "Have a seat." Abigail sat down, the distance between them feeling both vast and insignificant. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken words, with the echoes of their past, with the uncertainty of their future. "I've been thinking," Abigail finally said, her voice low, "about everything. About the ambush, about Thompson, and about us." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. And I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice honest. "You saved my life, Colt. You helped us stop Reyes. You could have escaped, but you didn't." "I told you," he said, his voice soft. "I'm not the same man I was." "But you're still an outlaw," she said, her voice challenging. "You've still committed crimes. You still have a price on your head." "I know," he said, his voice resigned. "I'm not asking for a pardon, Abigail, or for your forgiveness. I want a chance to prove myself, to show you that I can be different." The words resonated deep within her, stirring a longing she'd tried to suppress, a hope she'd thought long dead. She remembered the boy she'd loved, the man he'd once been, the spark of goodness that still flickered within him. "I don't know if I can trust you, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "Not completely." "Not yet." "I understand," he said, his voice filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Trust is earned, not given." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers, his touch hesitant, uncertain. "But I'll do whatever it takes, Abigail. To earn your trust, to earn your respect." The air crackled with unspoken desire, with the memory of their shared past, with the forbidden longing that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Abigail's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his skin against hers. But she couldn't. Not yet. "I need time, Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Time to figure things out, to decide what to do." He withdrew his hand, his expression hardening slightly. "Time is something I don't have a lot of, Abigail. The territorial marshal will be here soon to take me away." The reality of his situation hit her with full force. He was still a prisoner, his fate uncertain, his future hanging in the balance. And she was the one who held the key to his freedom or his imprisonment. "I know," she said, her voice filled with a growing sense of dread. "And I'll make a decision. Soon." As she stood up to leave, Colt's voice stopped her. "Abigail," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's something you should know. Something about that night. The night I left." Abigail turned back to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" He hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his expression filled with a pain she couldn't fully comprehend. "It wasn't just about protecting you from my family," he said, his voice hoarse. It was about protecting you from myself." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the echoes of a forbidden love that had been doomed from the start. And as Abigail walked away, she knew that the decision she had to make was even more complicated, more difficult, more heart-wrenching than she'd ever imagined. The echoes of the past were deafening, and the future was a storm-tossed sea. Chapter 13. The storm breaks over broken hearts. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon finally broke, unleashing its fury on redemption. The wind howled, the rain lashed down, the thunder roared, mirroring the turmoil within Abigail's heart. She sat in her office, the flickering lamplight casting long shadows on the walls, the sound of the storm a relentless reminder of the chaos that had engulfed her life. She'd spent the past few days wrestling with her decision, agonizing over Colt's fate, struggling to reconcile her duty with her feelings, her past with her present. She'd reviewed the evidence, questioned the witnesses, consulted with the town council, but the answer remained elusive, the path forward shrouded in doubt. The territorial marshal, a stern, unyielding man named Harding, had arrived earlier that day, demanding to take custody of Colt, to transport him to the territorial prison to face trial. Abigail had stalled, requesting more time, claiming she needed to gather additional evidence, but she knew her time was running out. She looked at the bottle of whiskey in her drawer, the temptation to numb the pain, to silence the doubts, almost overwhelming. But she resisted, knowing that clarity, not oblivion, was what she needed. She needed to make a decision that would not only determine Colt's fate, but also define her own. A knock on the door startled her. She quickly composed herself, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. "Who is it?" "It's me, Sheriff. Reverend Johnson." Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding.
"Come in, Reverend."
The Reverend entered, his coat soaked, his face etched with concern. "I saw the light, Sheriff. I thought you might need some company." Abigail gestured towards the chair opposite her desk. "Thank you, Reverend. I could use some." He sat down, his gaze meeting hers, his eyes filled with a wisdom that transcended the earthly realm. "You're troubled, Sheriff. I can see it in your eyes." Abigail sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I have a decision to make, Reverend. A difficult one. And I don't know what to do." "It's about the outlaw, isn't it?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Colt Dawson." Abigail nodded, her heart heavy. "He saved my life, Reverend. He helped us stop the Blackwood gang. But he's an outlaw. He's committed crimes. He has a price on his head. And you have feelings for him," the Reverend said, his voice not accusatory, but understanding. Abigail looked away, ashamed, unable to deny the truth. I don't know what I feel, Reverend. It's complicated." "Love often is, Sheriff," he said, his voice soft. "Especially when it's intertwined with duty, with betrayal, with the weight of the past." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "But love is also a powerful force, Sheriff. It can heal, it can redeem, it can transform. It can even move mountains." His words resonated deep within her, stirring a flicker of hope, a glimmer of possibility. She remembered the love she'd shared with Colt, the passion, the connection, the feeling that anything was possible. It had been shattered, yes, but perhaps it wasn't beyond repair. "But what about the law, Reverend?" she asked, her voice pleading. "What about my duty? What about the people of redemption?" "The law is important, Sheriff," he said, his voice firm. "But it's not always just. It's not always compassionate. And it's not always right." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "You have a choice, Sheriff. You can follow the letter of the law and send Colt Dawson to his likely death. Or you can follow your heart and give him a chance to prove himself, to redeem himself, to become the man you believe he can be." The storm raged outside, the wind and rain battering the windows, the thunder echoing the conflict within her soul. Abigail looked at the Reverend, her eyes filled with tears. She knew what she had to do. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, her voice trembling. You've given me the strength I needed." He smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "The strength was always within you, Sheriff. You just needed to find it." As he left, Abigail stood up, her heart pounding, her mind made up. The storm was breaking over broken hearts, but amidst the chaos, a new dawn was beginning to emerge. She knew what she had to do. And it started now. Chapter 14. Trials of Trust and Temptation. With her decision made, Abigail wasted no time. She went straight to Marshall Harding's room at the town's only hotel, the storm still raging outside, her oilskins doing little to protect her from the downpour. She found him preparing to leave, his saddlebags packed, his expression impatient. "Marshall," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her heart. "I've made a decision about Colt Dawson." Harding raised an eyebrow, his gaze skeptical.
"And?"
"I'm releasing him," Abigail said, her voice unwavering. "Into my custody." Harding scoffed. "You're what?" "Sheriff, you can't be serious. The man's a dangerous outlaw.
He needs to be brought to justice.
He's also the man who saved my life, and the lives of several others," Abigail countered, her voice rising. "He helped us stop the Blackwood gang. He deserves a chance." "A chance?" "He's had plenty of chances, Sheriff. And he's chosen to break the law every time." "He's changing, Marshall," Abigail insisted, her voice pleading. "I can see it. He's trying to be better." Harding shook his head, his expression unyielding. "You're blinded by your feelings for him, Sheriff. It's clouding your judgment." "My feelings have nothing to do with this," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "This is about justice, Marshall. About giving a man a chance to redeem himself." "It's about the law, Sheriff," Harding retorted, his voice hard. "And the law is clear. Colt Dawson is a criminal, and he must be punished." "I am the law in redemption, Marshall," Abigail said, her voice rising to a shout. "And I'm telling you he's staying here. Under my supervision." Harding stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but Abigail cut him off. "I've prepared a writ, Marshall," she said, pulling a folded document from her pocket. "It releases Colt Dawson into my custody on the condition that he remains in redemption, that he assists me in maintaining law and order, and that he makes restitution for his past crimes." Harding snatched the writ from her hand, his eyes scanning the document, his expression incredulous. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," he said, his voice low and threatening. "A big mistake. This will come back to haunt you." "Perhaps," Abigail said, her voice steady. "But I'm willing to take that risk." Harding crumpled the writ in his hand, his face turning red. "You'll regret this, Sheriff," he said, his voice filled with venom. "I'll be back. And when I do, I'll take him and you, if necessary." He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, leaving Abigail standing there, alone, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She defied the marshal, risked her career, her reputation, perhaps even her life, for a man she wasn't even sure she could trust. She went to the jailhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She found Colt in his cell, his expression questioning. "What's going on, Abigail?" he asked, his voice wary. "I heard shouting." She unlocked the cell door, her hand trembling slightly. "You're free to go, Colt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stared at her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Free? What do you mean?" "I've released you into my custody," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "On certain conditions." She explained the terms of the writ, the restrictions on his freedom, the expectations she had of him. He listened intently, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion to a cautious hope. You're trusting me?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "I'm taking a chance on you, Colt," she said, her voice honest. "Don't make me regret it." He stepped out of the cell, his presence filling the small space, his eyes meeting hers. "I won't, Abigail," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you I won't." The trials of trust and temptation had just begun. Abigail had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences, to navigate the treacherous path she'd chosen, to prove to herself, to the town, and to Colt that her faith in him wasn't misplaced. The storm outside had subsided, but the storm within their hearts was far from over. The air was thick with unspoken feelings, with the weight of their past, with the uncertainty of their future. Chapter 15. Running from the Ghosts of Yesterday. The days following Colt's release were a delicate dance of trust and suspicion, of hope and apprehension. Abigail kept him close, assigning him tasks around the jailhouse, using his skills and knowledge to help her maintain order and redemption. He was surprisingly cooperative, diligent, and respectful, his outlaw past seemingly a distant memory. But the townsfolk were less forgiving. They watched Colt with wary eyes, their whispers following him like shadows, their distrust palpable. Abigail did her best to reassure them, to vouch for him, but she knew it would take time and deeds, not words, to earn their acceptance. One afternoon, a stagecoach arrived in Redemption, bringing with it a reminder of Colt's past, a ghost he couldn't outrun. A group of bounty hunters stepped off the stage, their eyes scanning the town, their hands resting on their guns. They were looking for Colt Dawson, drawn by the hefty reward still offered for his capture. Abigail saw them from her office window, her heart sinking. She knew this was a test, a trial of Colt's newfound loyalty, a challenge to her authority and her judgment. She found Colt in the back of the jailhouse, cleaning the stables, his back to her. "Colt," she said, her voice urgent. "We have company." He turned, his expression questioning. She nodded towards the window, towards the bounty hunters. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He knew what it meant. "They're here for me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Yes," Abigail said, her voice steady. "But you're under my protection. I won't let them take you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked a lot like fear. "They won't give up, Abigail," he said, his voice low. "They're relentless. And they're not afraid to get their hands dirty." "Neither am I," Abigail said, her voice firm. "I'm the sheriff of this town, and I won't let them take you without a fight." She walked towards him, her hand resting on her gun. "But you have a choice, Colt," she said, her voice softer. "You can run. You can disappear. And they'll never find you." He stared at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to gauge her sincerity. He knew she was giving him an out, a chance to escape, to avoid the confrontation. "And leave you to face them alone?" he asked, his voice incredulous. "After everything you've done for me?" He shook his head, his expression resolute.
No, Abigail.
"I won't run. Not anymore. I'll stand with you. I'll fight." The ghosts of yesterday were still chasing him, but he was choosing to face them, to stand his ground, to protect the woman who'd given him a second chance, the woman who'd stirred something within him he'd thought long dead. Abigail felt a surge of relief, of pride, of something more. She'd trusted him, and he'd proven himself worthy of that trust. He was choosing to stay, to fight, to stand by her side. "All right," she said, her voice firm. "Then let's show them what redemption is made of." They walked out of the jailhouse together, side by side, the sheriff and the outlaw, united against a common enemy, their pasts intertwined, their futures uncertain. The bounty hunters saw them approaching, their eyes narrowing, their hands tightening on their guns. The showdown was about to begin. The ghosts of yesterday were here, but so was the promise of a different tomorrow. They were running towards something now, not just away. Chapter 16. A showdown at sunset. The tension in the town square was palpable, the silence broken only by the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the nervous coughs of the onlookers. Abigail and Colt stood facing the bounty hunters, a formidable pair, their presence radiating a quiet strength that belied the danger they faced. The leader of the bounty hunters, a grizzled man with a scarred face and cold, calculating eyes, stepped forward. "Sheriff Monroe," he said, his voice raspy. "We're here for Colt Dawson. He's a wanted man. And we aim to collect the reward." Abigail met his gaze unflinchingly. "Colt Dawson is under my protection, Captain. He's been released into my custody. You have no jurisdiction here." The bounty hunter chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Jurisdiction? Sheriff, we're bounty hunters. We go where the money is. And the money's on Dawson's head. He's cooperating with the law," Abigail said, her voice firm. He's helping us maintain order in this town. That's your problem, Sheriff, the bounty hunter said, his voice hardening. Not ours. We're taking him. One way or another. He gestured towards his men, who fanned out, their hands hovering over their guns. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Sheriff. Step aside and let us do our job. Abigail didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her hand resting on her own gun. You'll have to go through me, she said, her voice ringing out across the square. The townsfolk, who'd gathered to watch the confrontation, gasped, their fear and anticipation growing. They'd seen Abigail's courage before, but this was different. This was a showdown, a test of wills, a battle for the soul of redemption. Colt stepped forward, his voice low and calm. Abigail, don't do this. This is my fight. Let me handle it. No, Colt, she said, her voice unwavering. We're in this together. I won't let them take you. The bounty hunter laughed, a mocking sound that echoed through the square. You're a fool, Sheriff. You're protecting a criminal, a killer. He's not worth it. He's worth more than you know, Abigail said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the square, painting the sky in fiery hues of red and orange. The showdown was imminent, the tension reaching a breaking point. All right, Sheriff, the bounty hunter said, his voice cold and decisive. You've made your choice. We'll do this the hard way. He drew his gun, the movement swift and practiced. His men followed suit, their weapons aimed at Abigail and Colt. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail drew her own gun, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She saw Colt draw his movements fluid and graceful, his eyes focused on the bounty hunters. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence, followed by a barrage of gunfire, the roar of pistols echoing through the square. Abigail and Colt fired back, their shots accurate and deadly, their movements synchronized, their teamwork seamless. They fought with a courage and determination that surprised even the hardened bounty hunters. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they refused to yield, their bond strengthening with each passing moment, their love for each other, unspoken but undeniable, fueling their fight. The battle raged, bullets whizzing through the air, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. One by one, the bounty hunters fell, their bodies collapsing to the dusty ground, their thread extinguished. Finally, only the leader remained, his face contorted with rage, his gun aimed at Abigail. You're a dead woman, Sheriff, he shouted, his voice hoarse. But before he could pull the trigger, Colt shot him, the bullet finding its mark, the bounty hunter crumpling to the ground, his life extinguished. The silence returned, broken only by the ragged breathing of Abigail and Colt, the sobs of the onlookers. The showdown was over. The sheriff and the outlaw had prevailed. Abigail looked at Colt, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something more. Something that looked a lot like love. He was a very good shot. He met her gaze, his eyes filled with the same emotions, his expression softening. Are you all right? He asked, his voice concerned. I am now, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Thanks to you. The townsfolk, who'd witnessed the entire battle, erupted in cheers, their fear replaced by admiration, their distrust replaced by respect. They'd seen Colt fight for them, for Abigail, for redemption. And they'd finally accepted him, not as an outlaw, but as a hero. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the town, Abigail knew that the showdown had changed everything. It had tested their courage, their loyalty, their love. And it had proven that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of the greatest adversity, hope, redemption, and love could still prevail. Chapter 17. The masks we wear begin to crack. The aftermath of the showdown brought a sense of cautious optimism to redemption. The bounty hunters were gone, their threat extinguished, and Colt had proven his loyalty, earning the respect, if not the complete trust, of the townsfolk. Abigail, relieved and exhausted, found herself drawn to Colt, their bond strengthened by the shared danger, their unspoken feelings growing stronger with each passing day. But the peace was fragile, the scars of the past still raw, the future uncertain. Abigail knew that Colt's past could still catch up to him, that his enemies were still out there, that the law, in the form of Marshall Harding, could still come knocking. She also knew that she couldn't keep him confined to redemption forever, that he needed to be free, to make his own choices, to build his own life. But the thought of him leaving, of losing him again, filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the jailhouse, watching the stars emerge in the vast, darkening sky, Abigail decided to confront the issue, to address the elephant in the room. "Colt," she said, her voice hesitant, "we need to talk about your future." He looked at her, his eyes questioning, his expression guarded. "What about it?" "You can't stay here forever," she said, her voice soft. "You need to move on, to find your own place in the world." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I know," he said, his voice resigned. "I've been thinking about it." "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart aching with the thought of him leaving. He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I don't know. Somewhere where I can start over. Where no one knows my name, my past." "And what about us?" she asked, her voice trembling, the question hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "There is no us, Abigail," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not really. You're the sheriff, and I'm an outlaw, even if I'm not acting like one right now." "But you've changed," she insisted, her voice pleading. "You've proven yourself. You're a good man, Colt." "Maybe," he said, his voice filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "But the past, it's always there. It's a shadow that follows me, that keeps us apart." The masks they wore, the sheriff and the outlaw, were beginning to crack, revealing the vulnerable, wounded hearts beneath. But the cracks were also a reminder of the chasm that still separated them, the barriers that stood between them and a future together. I care about you, Colt," Abigail admitted, her voice barely audible, the words a confession, a risk, a leap of faith. He reached out, his hand gently touching hers, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "I care about you too, Abigail," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "More than you know." The air crackled with unspoken desire, with the memory of their shared past, with the forbidden longing that had simmered beneath the surface for years. They were so close, yet so far, their hearts reaching for each other, but their realities holding them back. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the street, breaking the spell, shattering the fragile intimacy. "Sheriff, we've got trouble." It was Deputy Johnson, his face pale and frantic. Abigail and Colt jumped up, their hands instinctively reaching for their guns. The masks were back on, the sheriff and the outlaw, ready to face whatever danger threatened their town, their fragile peace. The cracks remained, but for now, duty called, and they had to answer. The future and their feelings would have to wait. Chapter 18. Redemption found in unexpected arms. Abigail and Colt rushed towards the source of the commotion, finding a group of agitated townsfolk gathered outside the saloon. The air was thick with tension, the whispers of fear and anger swirling around them. "What's going on?" Abigail demanded, her voice sharp, her sheriff's mask firmly in place. "It's Jedediah," Deputy Johnson explained, his voice strained. "He's drunk, and he's causing trouble. He's got a gun, and he's threatening anyone who comes near him." Jedediah, the blacksmith, the man who'd been most vocal in his distrust of Colt. Abigail's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd feared, the kind of incident that could shatter the fragile peace they'd worked so hard to build. "Where is he?" she asked, her hand resting on her gun. "Inside the saloon," Johnson replied. "He's barricaded himself in." Abigail turned to Colt, her eyes meeting his. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm. "I'll handle this." But Colt shook his head, his expression resolute. "No, Abigail. I'm going with you." He's been looking for a reason to cause trouble, and he specifically hates me. This is my fault. It's not your fault, Colt, she insisted. It's his. And I'm the sheriff. It's my responsibility. We're in this together, remember? He said, his voice low and determined. Let me help you. Abigail hesitated, her mind racing. She knew he was right, that his presence could either escalate the situation or defuse it, depending on how he handled it. But she also knew that she couldn't keep him sheltered, protected, forever. He needed to face the town, to prove himself, to earn their trust, not just through her words, but through his own actions. All right, she said, her voice firm, but you follow my lead. No unnecessary risks. Understood? He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination. Understood. They approached the saloon cautiously, their guns drawn, the townsfolk parting to let them through. Abigail could hear Jedediah's drunken shouts from inside, his slurred words laced with anger and resentment. I'll go in first, Abigail said, her voice low. You cover me. She took a deep breath and pushed open the saloon doors, stepping inside, Colt right behind her. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sweat. Jedediah was standing behind the bar, a shotgun in his hands, his eyes wild and unfocused. Jedediah, Abigail said, her voice calm and steady. Put down the gun. Let's talk. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Talk. What's there to talk about, Sheriff? You've brought an outlaw into our town, a killer, a friend of yours. And you expect us to just accept it? He's helping us, Jedediah, Abigail said, her voice firm. He's changed. He's trying to make amends. He's a liar, Jedediah shouted, his voice slurring. Just like you. You're both in cahoots. You're protecting him. He raised the shotgun, aiming it at Abigail, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail saw the hatred in his eyes, the madness, the intent to kill. She braced herself, ready to fire back, to defend herself. But before she could pull the trigger, Colt stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body, his own gun aimed at Jedediah. Don't do it, Jedediah, Colt said, his voice calm and surprisingly gentle. Put down the gun. It's not worth it. Jedediah stared at him, his eyes widening in surprise, his anger momentarily forgotten. He saw Colt, not as an outlaw, but as a man who was willing to risk his life to protect the sheriff, to protect the town. You'd take a bullet for her? He asked, his voice incredulous. I would, Colt said, his voice firm. Without hesitation. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the depth of his feelings for Abigail, with the redemption he'd found in her, in this town, in this unexpected place. Jedediah's grip on the shotgun loosened, his eyes filling with tears. He lowered the weapon, his body trembling. I don't understand, he mumbled, his voice choked with emotion. I don't understand. Colt stepped forward, his hand outstretched. It's all right, Jedediah, he said, his voice soft. Just let it go. Let it all go. Jedediah looked at Colt's hand, then at Abigail, then back at Colt. He slowly reached out and took Colt's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. The tension in the saloon dissipated, replaced by a sense of relief, of understanding, of redemption. Abigail lowered her gun, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Colt had done it. He'd faced his accuser, defused the situation, and proven his worth, not with violence, but with compassion, with courage, with love. Redemption had been found in unexpected arms, not just for Colt, but for Jedediah, and for the town of Redemption itself. Chapter 19. The Unforgiving Truth Unveiled. The incident with Jedediah marked a turning point in redemption. The townsfolk, witnessing Colt's courage and compassion, began to accept him, their distrust slowly fading, replaced by a cautious respect. Abigail, relieved and proud, found herself drawing closer to Colt, their bond deepening, their unspoken feelings growing stronger with each passing day. But the past, like a persistent shadow, still lingered, threatening to disrupt their fragile peace, to shatter their hopes for a future together. Abigail knew that Marshall Harding wouldn't give up, that he'd be back, and that Colt's enemies were still out there, lurking in the shadows. One morning, a rider arrived in Redemption, bearing a message for Abigail. It was from Sarah, Colt's sister, her words urgent and filled with fear. "Abigail," the message read, "you must come quickly. It's Colt's past. It's caught up to him. I fear for his life, and for the life of my child." Abigail's heart sank. She knew this day would come, that the ghosts of Colt's past would eventually surface, demanding a reckoning. She showed the message to Colt, her hand trembling. He read it, his expression hardening, his eyes filled with a mixture of dread and determination. "I have to go to her," he said, his voice firm. "I have to protect her." "I'm going with you," Abigail said, her voice unwavering. "We're in this together." They rode hard, reaching Sarah's homestead in record time, their horses lathered in sweat, their hearts pounding with apprehension. They found Sarah huddled inside her small cabin, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with terror. "What is it, Sarah?" Colt asked, his voice urgent, his hand resting on her arm. "What's happened?" It's my husband's family," she said, her voice trembling. They found out about Colt, about his past, and they want revenge." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. She knew Colt's past was filled with violence, with bloodshed, with enemies who wouldn't hesitate to seek retribution. "Who are they, Sarah?" Abigail asked, her voice sharp. "What do they want?" They're the Blackwood family," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "The family of the men Colt killed. They want him dead. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." The truth, unforgiving and brutal, was unveiled. Colt's past wasn't just a collection of abstract crimes, it was a web of personal vendettas, of families torn apart by violence, of a cycle of revenge that threatened to consume them all. And it was all connected to the Blackwood gang, the very gang Colt had helped her bring down. Colt's face was a mask of pain, his eyes filled with a guilt she couldn't fully comprehend. He'd tried to escape his past, to redeem himself, but it had followed him, relentlessly, threatening to destroy everything he'd fought for, everything he'd come to care about. "They're coming, Colt," Sarah said, her voice filled with desperation. "They're coming for you, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Abigail looked at Colt, her eyes searching his. She saw the fear, the guilt, the resignation in his gaze. But she also saw something else, a flicker of defiance, a spark of determination, a refusal to surrender. "We'll fight them, Colt," she said, her voice firm. "We'll protect Sarah and her child. We'll face them together." He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a gratitude that went beyond words. He'd found redemption in her love, in her unwavering belief in him. And he wouldn't let her down. "Not now. Not ever." "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get ready. They're coming." The unforgiving truth had been unveiled, and the final battle was about to begin. It was a battle not just for survival, but for the soul of Colt Dawson, for the future of redemption, and for the love that had blossomed amidst the ashes of the past. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The Blackwood family arrived at dusk, a grim procession of riders silhouetted against the setting sun. They were led by a tall, imposing man with a weathered face and cold, cruel eyes, Elias Blackwood, the patriarch of the clan, the father of the men Colt had killed. Abigail, Colt, and Sarah stood waiting for them, armed and ready, their faces determined, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. They'd fortified Sarah's small cabin as best they could, barricading the windows, preparing for siege. "Colt Dawson." Elias Blackwood's voice boomed across the open space, his words laced with hatred and vengeance. "Come out and face your judgment. You can't hide from your past forever." Colt stepped forward, his rifle in hand, his expression unwavering. "I'm here, Blackwood," he said, his voice calm and steady. "What do you want?" "I want justice for my sons," Blackwood shouted, his voice filled with rage. "I want your life for theirs." You'll have to go through me, Abigail said, stepping forward, her own gun aimed at Blackwood. Colt is under my protection. He's surrendered to the law. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, mocking sound.
The law?
You think the law matters out here, Sheriff? This is about family, about blood, about revenge. He gestured towards his men, who fanned out, their weapons drawn, their eyes fixed on Colt and Abigail. We're taking him, Sheriff. And if you stand in our way, you'll die with him. The final confrontation had begun. It was a battle not just between two families, but between two ways of life, between vengeance and redemption, between hatred and love. Colt, Abigail said, her voice low and urgent. Take Sarah and get her out of here. I'll hold them off. But Colt shook his head, his expression resolute.
No, Abigail.
I'm not running. Not anymore. We fight together. He turned to Sarah, his voice softening. Go inside, Sarah. Stay safe. We'll handle this. Sarah, her face pale but determined, nodded and retreated into the cabin, clutching her pregnant belly. Abigail and Colt stood side by side, facing the Blackwood clan, their guns raised, their hearts intertwined. They were ready to fight for their lives, for their love, for their future. The first shot rang out, shattering the silence, followed by a volley of gunfire, the roar of weapons echoing across the plains. Abigail and Colt fired back, their shots accurate and deadly, their movements synchronized, their teamwork seamless. They fought with a courage and determination that surprised even the hardened Blackwood clan. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they refused to yield, their love for each other fueling their fight, their hope for a better future giving them strength. The battle raged, bullets whizzing through the air, the smell of gunpowder filling the air. One by one, the Blackwood men fell, their bodies collapsing to the ground, their vengeance thwarted. Finally, only Elias Blackwood remained, his face contorted with rage, his gun aimed at Colt. You may have killed my sons, Dawson, he shouted, his voice hoarse. But you won't escape me. I'll see you in hell. He pulled the trigger, but before the bullet could reach its target, Abigail stepped in front of Colt, shielding him with her body, taking the bullet meant for him. She gasped, her body jerking, her eyes widening in surprise. She staggered back, her hand clutching her side, blood staining her shirt. Abigail, Colt shouted, his voice filled with horror. He caught her as she fell, cradling her in his arms, his eyes filled with tears. He looked at Blackwood, his face a mask of rage, and fired, the bullet finding its mark, the patriarch collapsing to the ground, his vengeance finally silenced. Colt turned his attention back to Abigail, his heart breaking. Stay with me, Abigail, he pleaded, his voice choked with emotion.
Stay with me.
I love you. Abigail looked up at him, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the pain, the fear, the shadow of death. I love you too, Colt, she whispered, her voice weak. Always have her eyes closed, her body went limp, her breathing stopped. Colt held her close, his tears falling onto her face, his heart shattered into a million pieces. The final confrontation was over, but the price had been too high. He'd found redemption, but he'd lost everything. The horizon stretched before him, empty and desolate. He was alone. He was no one. Epilogue. Colt buried Abigail on a small rise overlooking redemption, a place where the sunrises were golden and the sunsets painted the sky in fiery hues. He carved her name on a simple wooden cross, adding the words, "Beloved Sheriff, beloved friend." He stood there for a long time, the wind whispering through the tall grass, the silence broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. He'd lost her. He'd lost the woman he loved, the woman who'd believed in him, the woman who'd given him a second chance. He'd found redemption, but at a cost he could barely comprehend. The townsfolk of Redemption came to pay their respects, their faces somber, their hearts filled with a mixture of grief and gratitude. They'd lost their sheriff, their protector, but they'd also gained something, a deeper understanding of courage, of compassion, of the transformative power of love. Sarah, Her newborn son cradled in her arms, stood beside Colt, her tears mingling with his. She'd named the baby Abel, a name that meant breath, a symbol of hope, of new beginnings. "She saved us, Colt," Sarah said, her voice soft. "She saved us all." Colt nodded, his eyes fixed on Abigail's grave. He knew Sarah was right. Abigail had sacrificed herself, not just for him, but for the entire town, for the principles she believed in, for the hope of a better future. He stayed in redemption for a while, helping Sarah with the baby, assisting the new sheriff, a young man named Johnson, who'd been Abigail's deputy. He tried to honor Abigail's memory, to live up to the ideals she'd embodied, to be the man she'd believed he could be. But the pain of her loss was too great, the memories too vivid, the emptiness too profound. He knew he couldn't stay, that he needed to move on, to find his own path, to build his own life, even if it was a life without her. One morning, as the sun rose over redemption, painting the sky in the colors Abigail had loved, Colt saddled his horse, his heart heavy, his eyes filled with a sadness that would likely never fade. He looked back at the town, at Abigail's grave, at the life he'd almost had. He rode away, not towards the sunset, but towards the dawn, towards a future that was uncertain, but that held the promise of something he couldn't quite define, but that he knew Abigail would have wanted him to find. He rode towards a new horizon, carrying her memory with him, her love, her courage, her belief in him. He rode towards a new beginning, a new life, a new redemption. He rode, finally, as the man she always knew he could be, the man she loved. He rode with purpose. The end.